Let's briefly review the context in which these new ideas about government emerged in the 11th century. Recall, in the last sequence, we talked about the changes that took place in Chinese society, economy, in the world, in fact, that China inhabited between the 8th century, when the Tang Dynasty was at the peak of its powers before the An-Lushan Rebellion, and the 11th century. The new dynasty, the Sung Dynasty in this case, which was founded in 960, had now come to exist in a multi-state world. It wasn't simply that there was a Chinese dynasty and tribal peoples around the edges. Now those tribal peoples had learned how to build states. And in the northeast, there were the Khitans, who had created the Liao dynasty, and in the northwest, there were the Tanguts, who had created the Xia dynasty. Domestically, there had been great changes as well. Now, 50% or more of the population lived in the south. And by the 1070s, probably the bulk of officials, certainly the bulk of officials who were making policy, were coming from the south. The south was different from the north, which had lost population. The south had a riverine economy, that is, water transport was easily available and cheap. It was commercializing, and commerce was playing an ever larger role. And in fact, in the Sung Dynasty, for the first time, taxes on commerce start to become a larger share of government revenues than taxes on land. It was a world socially without great clans. The aristocratic or state aristocracy that had come into existence during the medieval period and survived well into the Tang Dynasty to the very end had now disappeared for reasons we've already talked about. And instead, there's a new group of people we call literati, but importantly, people who are selected for government on the basis of learning. The world had changed, and the challenge in mid-11th century was, what should government do in this very different world? I've said it was the people who replaced the great clans were people we call literati. Well, that's how we translate the Chinese word shi, this word we've come across a number of times since the times of Confucius, a word that has gone through Chinese history as the common term for the elite, for that particular top layer, small top layer of society that was both a cultural elite and a social elite and a political elite. I've translated the term shi as literati because by the 11th century, a growing number of people are starting to see that what makes one a shi is not heredity, not the family you came from, which would have been true in Tang, but the learning you have acquired. Learning that can be proven and demonstrated and, above all, tested. In the late 10th century, the government decides that, given that they're no longer aristocrats, no longer families of long service to government, that they're going to recruit officials through an examination. We call the civil service examination. These would be people who entered government on the basis of learning, and that learning would be tested by competitive examinations. And this is important to keep in mind because when Wang and Sima and Su passed, what the examination tested was in fact one's literary ability. The very first test in the examinations was a test of your ability to compose poems. To give you some sense of how literati saw themselves, let me tell you a joke, a literati joke from the late 11th century. Well, it doesn't make much sense to tell a joke without an audience. So here we're going to show you a clip of how I told it once in class, and you'll see how the class reacts to it. So let me tell you a story, which I actually read in a book written in around 1090 or something like this. And the story is of a prefect. Remember, there are provinces, prefectures, and counties. A prefecture would be an area around the size of Rhode Island, for example. And the prefect, who's sort of like the governor of Rhode Island, goes to visit, has just arrived in his post, and he goes to the major Buddhist temple to say hello to the abbot, who is one of these Chan or Zen abbots. And the abbot receives him. The abbot's sort of sitting up on a chair on the dais, sort of in the temple courtyard. And the prefect comes in, big retinue and everything. And the abbot says, hey, come on up, sit down. doesn't go through a whole elaborate ceremony. And then, they're sort of chatting, and then 50 minutes later, some military guy comes in from the local garrison, and the abbot gets off his chair, gets off the dais, walks down and bows and scrapes and goes through a whole politeness routine with this military guy. Our prefect is really, really pissed off. And the abbot comes back and he says to the abbot, how come when I came in, you greeted me so impolitely and I sat up, you just sat here, and now this lowly military man comes in and you do through this whole elaborate routine of politeness. And the abbot says, oh, he says, impoliteness is true politeness. Politeness is impoliteness. And it's sort of a really Zen answer. And so our prefect goes over and starts to slap him upside the head, saying, hitting is non-hitting. Non-hitting is hitting, right? Well, every story has a point. There's no such thing as a free joke in a lecture. So what's the point? There are two implications to this. The first is the tension between military and civil. We had gone back to the period after the Tang Dynasty. Military figures had the power. They may not have always had the cultural prestige, but they certainly had the power. What's happened now is that our prefect, right, a civil official, is making it very clear to the monk that civil officials have precedence over the military. So that's a political change. Who controls power? What kind of government is this to be? It's going to be a civil government, and civil interests will triumph over military interests. The second issue is ideological. The monk is being dismissed by the official on the grounds that he's just talking nonsense. He can't say what he's saying. The official doesn't say it. The official regards himself as a good Confucian scholar official. The monk is a Buddhist, a Chan Buddhist, a Zen Buddhist. Ideologically speaking, if we were going back to the 8th century, really, certainly the first half of the 8th century, the leading philosophical voices in society would have been Buddhist. Today, in the 11th century, it's different. The leading voices now are starting to become Confucians, a new kind of Confucianism which says our ideology, our ideas ought to be guiding us as we take control of government and try to figure out what government should do. So the literati had started to think about their role in society in the 11th century, and I think that's the subtext of this joke I just told. And they're asking how government can serve the common good. To be honest about this, we can trace these attitudes back to the Tang Dynasty. One of the first people to talk about it and talk about a sort of a new view of government and the role learning should play was a man named Han Yu, who's known to us as the founder of the ancient style movement, the ancient style in literature, of turning back to antiquity to find models for the present and representing those models through your own literary style and the content of what you write. Han Yu may not have had so much influence in his own times, but in the 11th century he became, in some sense, one of the most important of literary intellectuals. Ouyang Shou, for example, whose works you're going to read in a second as well, turned back to Han Yu for a model. Liu Zhengyuan, another Tang ancient style writer, contemporary with Han Yu, also was influential in the 11th century. Wang Anshi was one of the people recommended by Ouyang Shou. Su Shi was one of the people recommended by Ouyang Shou. And Sima Guang was a person who was deeply suspicious of all these literary types with their ideas of transforming the world through government and taking their models from antiquity. So we're going to stop now. We'd like you to read some of the writings by Ouyang Shou and Han Yu and Liu Zhengyuan and tell us what you think about them.